Thanks, Stefan, and thank you all for having me here. I've been told that this just goes to the little recording device over there, so if I'm not loud enough, let me know, but I've never been accused of not being loud enough. So, yeah, I'm Dr. Kate Stafford. I'm primarily at the Applied Physics Lab at the University of Washington, but I also have an affiliate appointment at the School of Oceanography. And what I do is study the sounds of marine mammals. For about the past 10 years or so, I've been focused in the Arctic. And the reason studying the sounds of marine mammals can be a really good way to learn about them is you can hear over much greater distances than you can see. Sounds travel really far underwater. You can listen 24 hours a day, even when the weather is crummy, even when your habitat is covered with ice. And I'll be talking about that ice-covered habitat shortly. But because this is largely an undergraduate class, what I really wanted to give you guys some insight into is, at least in my experience, scientific discovery and a lot of science and a lot of my career has largely happened through serendipity. Essentially, being at the right place at the right time, or having things go terribly, terribly, terribly wrong, and having somebody down the hall say, hey, you will graduate, here's some data. I had a lot of projects when I was a master's student go terribly, terribly wrong. But because I had this language background with the French, I was offered this position down the hall to do my master's using passive acoustic monitoring. And another sort of plug for having a broad undergraduate education is, yeah, French literature has always been kind of a passion of mine, but because I've learned to speak French, all of a sudden, all these colleagues from France want to bring me over to France and work with me. So learn a foreign language, travel, go see people, don't kill them. So my talk is going to be about bowhead whales. But because most people in this room maybe had never heard about a bowhead whale, except perhaps for Jay, I want to introduce this superlative animal. So bowhead whales are the only truly Arctic baleen whale. They spend their lives in the Arctic associated with the ice. And in the Arctic, there are 4 populations of bowhead whales. And the only reason I'm bothering to spend time pointing this out is because over the next about 45 minutes, I'm going to take you on a tour of most of the Arctic and most of these whales. Our whales, the Bering, Chukchi, Beaufort, or Western Arctic whales, and we in the dark are somewhere right about here, they're a population that's actually doing pretty well. They migrate from the Bering Sea through Bering Strait, along the coast of Alaska to Canada annually, and then they return. This is a population that right now may be as many as 20,000. They may have recovered to pre-whaling numbers. Another population that's doing pretty well is the one that's found between Greenland and Canada. And that's sometimes referred to as the East Canada, West Greenland population. I'm not going to talk about the Sea of Okhotsk, about which we know very little. This is a population that resides in Russian waters. It's resident to the Sea of Okhotsk. And there's been very little information about these whales. What I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about, though, are whales from Spitsbergen. So at one time, this was thought to be the largest virgin or pre-whaling population of bowhead whales. Estimates range from anywhere from 50,000 to over 100,000 individuals. Now, the reason we don't have very good data on these animals is that basically by the early 1700s, they were essentially commercially extinct. So bowhead whales are ice adapted. They're slow to reproduce. But one of the coolest things about them, and this is something that we learned from the Inupiaq and that has since been proven through Western science, is they can live to be 200 years old. So there are bowhead whales alive today that may have been born before the US Civil War. Bowhead whales are also capable of breaking ice up to half a meter thick. Now, of course, the ice you see in this picture is only a few centimeters. And it's not like they ram the ice like you see submarines, but they push it up enough so that they can sip a little bit of air under relatively heavy ice. But the 2 things that got them in trouble is bowhead whales have the thickest blubber layer of any whale, and they have the longest baleen. And this is just an example from the University of Copenhagen showing you the baleen. which are keratinous plates that hang down from the top of their mouth, and they use these to filter feed. So both the oil from rendering the fat and the baleen, which was used like the plastic of our days, meant that bowhead whales were a very, very lucrative prey. In fact, they were so lucrative that whalers were willing to go up into the Arctic in wooden ships in the ice, even as early as the 1600s, and essentially risk their lives and their livelihoods to kill whales. And here you're looking at barrels and barrels and barrels of oil, and then many, many, many plates of baleen. As sort of an interesting aside, for those of you who are interested in history, so much money was made from whaling that during the US Civil War, the Confederacy sent a ship, the CSS Shenandoah, around to the Arctic to try and destroy Yankee whaling ships. And in fact, they ended up destroying, I think, 38 different whaling ships and essentially crippled the bowhead whaling for pretty much the next 20 years in the Pacific. Now, in sort of an interesting twist, the captain, Captain Waddell, stopped in Hawaii to provision on his way to the Arctic. And at that point, General Lee had already surrendered. The war was over. But he considered this fake news. So he continued to the Arctic. And even after the end of the Civil War, was taking out these Yankee whaling ships. So what was this used for? Right? The oil was used for soap, margarine, lighting, lubricating watches and machinery. And baleen, which was also known as whalebone, but is not bone at all, again, it's like our fingernails and our hair, was used for things like buggy whips, eyeglass frames, and, ladies, my favorite, corset stays, because everybody needs an hourglass figure. So essentially, in the Atlantic Arctic, really by the early 1800s, the population of bowhead whales had plummeted. So at this point, not only does the price of both baleen and whale oil go up, but unrelated, oil was discovered on land. And so we moved from whale oil to kerosene and fossil fuels. And the irony is not lost on me that, in fact, the discovery of oil on land may, in fact, have saved bowhead whales and right whales and many sperm whales and many other whales from extinction. And yet today, given that our fossil fuel extraction is changing the environment in which we all live, this discovery may now end up not saving the whales, but certainly altering their habitat. However, it's not all bad news. The good news is, it turns out, if you stop killing whales, they reproduce. And in some cases, populations actually rebound. So this just shows you a chart of population estimates from the Western Arctic, or Bering-Chukchi-Beaufort bowhead whales. Try to say that 5 times fast. Starting in about the late 1970s, the last population estimate we got was in 2011, and that was well up over 18,000 animals, which is really good news. Now, these data, which are obtained from a combination of visual and acoustic surveys, are very hard to come by. So if you want to watch a whale and count them, you stand out on the ice. The lead changes, and the lead is the open water between the shore-fast ice, so ice that's stuck to land, and sea ice. And every spring, as spring comes, the Arctic warms, a lead opens in front of Barrow, now known as Oceanographer, and the whales migrate through. But you know, even when it's sunny, it can be really, really cold. And of course, a lot of times, it's cold, foggy, dark, and icy. And finally, when you're working in the Arctic, trying to do a visual survey or putting your hydrophone in the water, you are putting yourself back into the food chain. And while I love seeing bears, like, my heart always starts to go a little bit faster. So for many of these reasons, passive acoustic monitoring in the Arctic has proven to be a really good method for learning about marine mammals. And what I use a lot of are these oceanographic moorings. So big instrumentation where you might use a train wheel for an anchor. That's reduce and reuse, if not recycle. You put your instrument out, and it's held up underwater by a big float that you need to make sure is deep enough under the ice that it won't get taken out. And I will say nowadays we lose fewer instruments because there's less ice. But to get your data back, and this big thing here is a hydrophone, and it's essentially got a recorder in it, so it's listening and recording year-round. You've got to get the instrument back. So we have no visual confirmation of what's going on with our acoustic data. And, of course, with acoustic data, the animals have to be making sounds for you to detect them. Now, the good news is all marine mammals make sound. Sound is probably the most important sense for marine animals. Light doesn't travel very far underwater. Chemical cues don't travel very far. They use sound, both the production and reception of it, to navigate, to find food, to migrate, to find mates. And different species make distinctly different sounds. It may well be that different individuals make different sounds, but at this point, we can't figure that out, or we haven't yet. Maybe one of you really smart students out here can sort that out. But we can tell, a beluga whale from a bearded seal. Let's see if this works. From a walrus. All these sounds are walrus. It's amazing. And so by listening to animals, we can tell who's where, when. We can get a feel for some migratory patterns and some of their behaviors. But we still don't know the entire repertoire or why animals make all of their sounds. And we're learning a lot about bowhead whales. So bowhead whales make sounds too. They migrate through ice-filled waters, often during periods of 24-hour darkness. And this whoop, whoop sound is a very simple sound they make that they may be using to navigate around ice flows. They may be using it to maintain contact as they migrate. But not only do they make these simple sounds, bowhead whales also sing. And it's this singing that I'm going to talk about. So the first songs that were ever recorded from bowhead whales were recorded off of Oceanography, Alaska, during the spring, over short time periods, using sonobuoys. And what researchers then found out was that bowhead whales in a population sing one song per year, very similar to what humpback whales do. Some of the more recent research suggests that this might not be quite the case. So, what do narwhals have to do with bowheads? And this is where some of the serendipity comes in. This is what a narwhal sounds like, maybe. I had this as my ringtone for a while, and I would jump every time it went off. So what narwhals have to do with bowhead whales is, of course, they're both Arctic. And in 2007, a colleague of mine, Kristen Lydra, who knows a lot about narwhals, was going to Greenland. And we wanted to get some recordings of narwhals, because up to that point, there were only a handful of papers in the literature about narwhal sounds, and none from Western Greenland. So I sent her with a sonobuoy, which is an instrument that sends a radio signal back to a radio receiver in the hopes that we'd get some narwhal recordings. And she went to this beautiful place called Disko Bay, spelt with a K, not a C, off the west coast of Greenland. And she deployed a sonobuoy and sat in this nice, spectacular research station listening to what the sonobuoy was recording. And I was at my parents' house in Bend, Oregon, and I don't know, it might have been Easter or something. and I get this phone call from Greenland. And it's Kristen, and she's holding up her phone to the radio receiver, and she says, "What the heck is this?" It's like, that's not a narwhal. It's not a bearded seal. And it's not a walrus. Had to be a bowhead whale. And this went on for hours and hours and hours. And that was super cool, right? It was the first recording of bowhead whales from off of West Greenland, or singing bowhead whales from off of West Greenland. But when Kristen brought all the data back, what we found was she hadn't recorded just one song type. There were two. And most of the time, acousticians are not super clever in the way we name songs. And it gets a lot less interesting from here on out. But what I just played you was what we call the warble song, because it ends with that woo, 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 woo. But she also recorded this strangled cat. And I know that sounds mean, but have a listen. This is a whale. And what you're looking at here are spectrograms. These are pictures of sound with time on the x-axis and frequency on the y. So this just made us think of like about here. So I just want to point out a couple things. This song is only about 30 seconds long. The strangled cat is twice that. And you can see if you look at the spectrogram that they look very different. So if you think about notes on a piano or different frequencies, you can almost think about each of these as a note or a letter in the alphabet. So this was surprising to us. In a population of bowhead whales, we were recording that's an iceberg calving, two very distinctly different songs, which was different from what we knew from Western Alaska, that bowhead whales in one population sing only a single song per year. Oop. So that was neat, sort of tucked it away. Kristen and I wrote a little paper. But then the following year, I had the luck to be able to go, well, actually I didn't get to go, to send my hydrophone, which got to go, to Fram Strait between Spitsbergen and Greenland, and put a hydrophone in the middle of this area that used to be a bowhead whale whaling ground. And our thought here was we just wanted to put out a couple of hydrophones in the hopes of hearing any bowhead whales. So I said at the beginning that the Spitsbergen population was brought to certainly commercial extinction, if not actual extinction, in the 1700s. And up until very recently, it was thought that there were only tens of animals left in the population, despite over 300 years of no whaling. Did I mention that bowhead whales reproduce really slowly? But our thought was, well, let's put a hydrophone out and see if we hear anything, any bowhead whales at all. And we were hoping to hear some grunts or some whoops. We certainly weren't really expecting to hear song. But the idea was if we could find out when in the year bowhead whales were in Fram Strait, we could send a scientific expedition to get photos, to get biopsies, to maybe try and do a population estimate to update what we knew about this critically endangered population. And our mooring was piggybacked on an oceanographic array that just happened to be right in the middle of a bowhead whale whaling ground from the 16 and 1700s. And we put the mooring out. It stayed out there for a whole year. And when we got back, or when we got the data back, honestly, I was more dumbfounded than I had been at my parents' house when I was listening on my cell phone to the crazy bowhead whales from Davis Strait. Because we didn't get just a few whoops and cries. Throughout the year, we had bowhead whales singing the whole year round. And I'll just orient you a little bit. So the little green dot is our mooring. This is sea ice coverage. The blue line is sea ice concentration. And so you can see from about September until May, you've got 90 to 95%, sometimes even more sea ice concentration. So it's an area that is covered in sea ice. The black line just shows you when there's daylight. So from late October until sometime in February, it's polar night, 24-hour darkness. So if you went out there to try and find a bowhead whale, you never would. And the green bars are the number of hours per day that had singing bowhead whales. And this, I mean, it really kind of blew my mind. And there's not been very many opportunities in my relatively short, or maybe not, scientific career where I've just been awestruck by my data. So we have these bowhead whales that are singing. And they're singing under the cover of darkness in lots of ice, far from the ice edge. And we thought, well, you know, it's a region that's ice covered for most of the year, so maybe that's good bowhead whale habitat. Or maybe it's better for sound transmission, because even though ice overhead can be very, very, very noisy, when there's little wind and the ice isn't moving, it's almost like a coliseum or like the most amazing opera house you've ever been to. You know, and the hydrophone was in polar water, so we thought maybe that's really good bowhead habitat. And probably what's most important is we thought we'd found a breeding location for bowhead whales for this critically endangered population. So we had singing all the time during the winter. And then when I looked through the data and looked at all of the individual hours of data, what we found was we had I won't say ridiculous, but an astonishing diversity in the number of very different songs that were recorded. And this is just a background slide to show you spectrograms from some of them. But the take-home point is we got songs from October to April and recorded 66 distinctly different sounds. These are not differences between, how would I say? Some of the differences in these songs would be like the difference between A, B, C, D, and Metallica. I mean, they're that different, and they're really very distinct, and so you could tell them apart. And what you'll see here is, you know, the numbers of the songs, because at this point we can't start naming them Strangled Cat and Warble Song and Fingers on a Blackboard, because that just takes up too much text. These are the number of new songs in every month, and then sometimes you'll see a few songs were repeated in following months. So that was kind of interesting. And with all these different songs, of course, one has to wonder who is doing all the singing. But just to convince you, and because I personally love listening to bowhead whale songs, I'm going to play you two brief songs, one from November and one just a month later, to convince you that these are very different songs that we're listening to. You can sort of hear the echoing. And what's also really interesting, I don't know if you could listen for it, bowhead whales can make two sounds at the same time. So right now they're making this whoop at the same time as they're making this. think you get the point. And this one, you can hear a little bit of fuzziness behind it. That's because ambient noise levels are a little bit higher. But you can hear how different and see how different these songs are. So one of the immediate things that this sort of discovery of all these different songs had us think was, gosh, first of all, maybe we found a breeding ground for this really endangered species, and I'll talk a little more about that later. But also, the extent of singing and the diversity suggested that perhaps there were more than tens of animals in the population. And this, for such an endangered species, has really big conservation implications. So even though we don't know who sings, really, we have some more questions. And to answer them, we put the hydrophones back in Fram Strait to ask, is it a region in which bowhead whales are heard every year? Is it really critical habitat? And do we hear the same songs in different years? Is this a playlist that's set on repeat? Now, the answer to the first question is yes. Bowhead whales appear to be at this location in Fram Strait every year, and they sing abundantly every year. The answer to the second question is no. So for 3 additional years of data, we now know that no song was ever heard in more than 1 year. And at least 186 new and different songs have been sung in Fram Strait up to 2014. And this just shows you the number of new songs by month and by year to show that bowhead whales are in this area all the time, and their song diversity keeps changing. Which is really interesting, but also really confusing. Who does all this singing? What are these whales doing? Do different whales or groups, do cohorts share songs? Does an animal change songs throughout its life or throughout a season? You know, we found that song type changed really quickly, even from day to day, certainly from month to month. What was going on? Who is singing? And to attempt to answer that, we went back to the place where bowhead whales were first recorded. So we headed back to Oceanography, Alaska, during the spring when we know that bowhead whales are migrating along the coast. So we put a hydrophone here off of Barrow, now known as Oceanographic, and we know that in the spring, bowhead whales are migrating, and they're migrating to the north and to the east. They're not feeding during this time. They want to get to the Canadian Beaufort Sea and chow down on copepods. So based on data from both observers, from traditional ecological knowledge, and from satellite telemetry, these are tracks of bowhead whales that were tagged with satellite tags, we know that bowhead whales are not lingering in front of Barrow in the spring. They do some lingering in the fall, but not in the spring. So what we did is we put a hydrophone out and we made some assumptions. We looked at the acoustic data when we got it back, and what we found was, whereas in the 1980s, only a single song had been recorded per year, now in 2011, we recorded over 12 songs in a period of 6 weeks. So something had changed in this population over time. But more importantly, when we looked at when each song was recorded, it suggested to us that probably some whales do share songs and others sing something completely different. So the way we figured this out, and pardon this, I know it's kind of like a kindergarten calendar, we assumed that if we heard a whale singing on Sunday, and we knew it didn't linger, but we put some bounds on that, the whale that we heard singing on Wednesday was not the same whale. So if you think of each color as a different song type, our Sunday whale didn't linger around until Wednesday and change from the red song to the blue song. And then the whales that showed up 2 weeks later singing the red song also couldn't be this whale. So this suggested that some whales share a song and some whales don't. For instance, we only recorded this green song or the purple song once, a single individual. So we had hoped in doing this little experiment to show that everybody has their own song, or cohorts, like groups of whales that are migrating together, share a song. And in fact, we couldn't figure that out at all. Now we know that some whales do share songs, but others don't, which doesn't answer any questions, but poses quite a few more. So what are these whales doing? You know, we know that what we do know is that some share songs. We don't know if they're related, or maybe if they're cohorts. I don't know about you guys, but there are some songs from like the summer of my junior year or senior year that whenever I hear them on the radio now, of course for you that's probably oldies, but I can go back immediately to that summer and I can give you the date and the time and think about everything I was doing then. So maybe whales that are in the same cohorts share a song. Maybe there's a song of the year. And because populations are getting so big now, maybe we're getting lots of songs of the year. Of course, that doesn't explain why songs change so completely between one year and the next, and we don't really hear the same songs from one year. You know, songs appear in a month and then usually disappear, so that does suggest some sort of seasonal progression. But when we've looked at the complexity of songs, it doesn't really seem to change over time. And we don't know why they all change completely between years. So we don't actually have a response to who's singing, or we do, but I would say now we've got more questions than answers, which is both cool and frustrating. So what we assume is that they're male whales. And what we know about song in other great whales, and great whales are the baleen whales, humpback whales, blue whales, fin whales. You know, we think it's produced by males. It's produced seasonally, that we know, and with the bowhead whales we know that too, because we've recorded bowhead whales in the fall, and they make very simple calls. They don't sing in the fall or the summer. Now in humpback whales, which you have probably heard of, and maybe you've even heard humpback songs, all males in the same population sing more or less the same song within a year. That song changes through the year and changes between years, but everybody is in lockstep singing the same song. Bowhead whales obviously don't do that. Now, blue and fin whales also sing, but these songs don't change substantially over time. We're assuming that it's males, because if you look throughout the animal kingdom, from insects to birds to even mice and deer, it's always males, and we think it's a reproductive display, either to attract females, but more likely as some way to mediate male-male interaction. So essentially to establish your spot in the dominance hierarchy. And why would you bother? So it certainly seems like a display like this. If you're a big male elephant seal and you want to be in charge of this group of females and tell all comers coming in from the beach that you're the biggest guy, it's a lot safer for everybody than resolving things with a battle. So when two male elephant seals think that they're about evenly matched, they go at it until somebody slinks off into the water. So maybe bowhead whales are doing this. We certainly think humpback whales might be, because if you play back the song of a humpback whale underwater, the animals that respond are always males. And of course we know a lot about humpback whales because they produce their displays, you know, in places like Hawaii, where the water's clear and it's warm and you can swim and you can look at their genital slits, which I would never really recommend doing in this. Because this is the realm of the bowhead whale. So we've listened underwater, but we haven't seen what they're doing, which has led to these really cool discoveries, but so many answers. You know, it's almost impossible in this environment to figure out who is doing what. So what do we think we know? We've still got a mystery to solve. I think what we do know, or what I'm convinced of, is that this behavior of the bowhead whale is unique among mammals and maybe even other animals that sing, with the exception of some songbirds, which are incredibly prolific. You know, we've got ideas, hypotheses, but it's certainly possible that we will never have a solution to why they sing, why they change their song so much, and why there's so much diversity. And I kind of like that idea, that, again, there's a mystery out there that we might not solve, maybe not in my lifetime. There are some hypotheses. So maybe the song diversity is a result of population expansion. Maybe there's just more bowhead whales out there. We certainly seem to know that for a number of populations. In fact, the latest population estimate for those Spitsbergen whales is over 300 animals. And because of this acoustic data, there's now a whole research program surrounding those whales. And they've taken out helicopters and gotten a helicopter estimate. They've gotten biopsies of the whales. So now they're using the acoustics to drive other science that's going to teach us more about Spitsbergen bowhead whales. Another thought, though, is because sea ice is melting in the Arctic, and it is, maybe there's immigration or exchange among these populations of bowhead whales that used to be excluded from each other by really heavy ice. There was a really interesting paper in 2012 where bowhead whales from the Western Arctic population and the Eastern Canada West Greenland population, not unrelatedly, were instrumented with satellite tags. And these are tags that you put in the whale's back, and it sends a location to the satellite. And you know, at the same time and in the same place, two instrumented whales just happen to meet up in the Canadian Arctic archipelago. I mean, this suggests that bowhead whales may now be able to essentially cross the Arctic. An idea that I've been thinking about a lot more, though, is that maybe all of this diversity in bowhead singing is driven by the environment in which they live. So if you're the only baleen whale in the Arctic, you don't have to first say, hey, I'm a humpback, or hey, I'm a blue whale. So you don't have to be in lockstep with everybody else. You can just start singing, and maybe your song is a little more interesting than the next guy's. But it may also be that the habitat of the Arctic drives some of this novelty. So interestingly, bowhead whales are most closely related to right whales. And right whales don't sing. Right whales form these surface active groups where a female will be in the middle and she does some screaming to bring males in. And then there's a big kerfuffle. And it's thought that right whales, and bowhead whales too, use something called sperm competition to be the father of the next generation of whales. I'm trying to figure out how to be very PC. Now, bowhead whales living in the Arctic can't really be rolling around at the surface going crazy because ice is very, very dynamic. And regions where you can potentially surface to breathe might be really small, and they change. So I wonder if bowhead whales have developed two strategies in terms of reproduction, because like right whales, they have giant testicles, and they probably use sperm competition. But unlike right whales, they also sing. So who knows? I certainly don't. If anybody here has any ideas, I'd be happy to hear them. And so that there's time for questions, I'm going to end on this beautiful drawing that was made by a 7th grader in Sitka, Alaska, and play a little song for you. Also, she wanted me to point out, these are puffins, not penguins.